I drove 4 hours through a blinding Colorado blizzard just to find my luggage dumped at a freezing basement stairwell. My sister smirked from the warmth of the living room, announcing that my parents booked the master suites for her husband, and their child. She told me they were the real family now, and a single woman like me could sleep on an air mattress by the water heater. I looked at them calmly, said I would just leave, and walked right back out into the snow. 2 hours later, ignoring dozens of their frantic calls, I received a notification that would completely destroy their perfect vacation. My name is Sloane, 33 years old, and my family has always treated me like a disposable afterthought. Before I dive into exactly how I turned their luxury getaway into a frozen nightmare, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever walked away from toxic relatives who severely underestimated you. The heavy tires of my SUV slipped on the thick, icy driveway as I finally pulled up to the luxury cabin in Aspen. It was supposed to be our annual family winter retreat. I spent all morning carefully navigating treacherous mountain passes, exhausted, but hoping this trip might be different. I hauled my duffel bag up the wooden steps, shaking snow from my coat as I pushed open the front door. The warmth of the grand living room washed over me, smelling of pine and expensive firewood. But the warm welcome ended there. My mother, Catherine, stood by the massive stone fireplace. She did not offer a hug or even a simple greeting. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward a narrow, unlit hallway leading down to the basement. She told me to leave my boots by the door and take my bag downstairs immediately. I asked her which of the guest rooms I was taking. Catherine took a slow sip of her wine and shook her head. She informed me that there was no guest room for me. The master suites were reserved for those who actually needed them. She said the real family took priority. My younger sister Brittany strolled into the room, adjusting her pristine white cashmere sweater. She wrapped her arms around her husband Donovan. Donovan is an African-American investment broker who always wears arrogance like a tailored suit. He flashed a brilliant, condescending smile in my direction. Brittany announced that Donovan, and their toddler absolutely required the 3 main bedrooms, one for them, one for the baby, and one for her wardrobe and Donovan to take his important client calls. Donovan laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He looked me up and down, taking in my snow-covered boots and plain winter coat. He told me a single woman working some boring office job in the city did not need a real bed. He said I was used to roughing it anyway. Donovan casually swirled the amber liquid in his crystal glass and decided to twist the knife further. He reminded everyone about the time my parents had to co-sign the lease for his brand new Porsche. He loudly proclaimed that families support each other, unlike me. He called me deeply selfish for refusing to empty my personal savings account to fund his luxury car down payment 2 years ago. My parents had bailed him out instead, treating my financial boundaries as a personal insult. I stood there frozen, but it had nothing to do with the winter storm raging outside. My blood boiled hot beneath my skin. I looked past Donovan and Brittany, searching for my father. Charles sat in a deep leather armchair by the window. He was pretending to read a financial newspaper. He actively refused to make eye contact with me. This was his signature move, withdrawing completely to let my mother and sister do the dirty work of putting me in my place. He allowed them to humiliate me silently, endorsing every cruel word by refusing to intervene. Catherine stepped forward, gesturing vaguely toward the dark stairs. She told me there was an old air mattress next to the utility closet in the unfinished basement. She instructed me to grab extra blankets from the laundry room because the heating down there was broken. They expected me to accept this indignity. They expected me to lower my head, drag my bag into the freezing dark, and be grateful I was allowed inside their rented palace. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at all 4 of them, letting the utter disrespect wash over me for the very last time. I calmly told them that if there was no space for me, then I would leave. Brittany rolled her eyes, muttering that I was always throwing temper tantrums to ruin their fun. Donovan chuckled, betting I would be back knocking on the door in 10 minutes when I realized the local motels were full. I zipped my coat up to my chin. I grabbed the handle of my duffel bag, turned around, and walked right back out into the freezing snow, letting the heavy door slam shut behind me. The biting wind hit my face as I climbed back into the driver's seat of my car. I turned the key, blasting the heater, as my hands gripped the wheel. As I shifted the car into gear, my cell phone buzzed loudly in the cup holder. The screen lit up with an urgent push notification from my private wealth management portal. It was an automated alert regarding a specific high-value real estate asset in Aspen. I looked at the property address on the screen, then looked up through the snow at the massive luxury cabin my family was currently occupying. They had no idea who actually owned the roof over their heads. They were completely unaware that the luxury property legally belonged entirely to me. The blizzard pounded violently against the windshield of my SUV as I navigated the treacherous winding curves of the mountain road. The car heater blasted at full force, slowly thawing my numb fingers, but the chill of my family's betrayal burned hot and relentless in my chest. They genuinely thought they had won. They thought casting me out into a lethal winter storm was the ultimate power move. My sister Brittany and her arrogant husband Donovan probably popped open a bottle of expensive champagne the second I walked out that door, toasting to their stolen master suites and their undisputed status as the real family. My father Charles likely retreated to his leather armchair by the fire, completely satisfied that his problem child had been dismissed, without him having to lift a single finger or say a single word in my defense. They believed I was just a lowly administrative worker, entirely dependent on their good graces and forced to accept whatever scraps of accommodation they threw my way. But what they did not understand was the colossal, life-altering mistake they had just made. They assumed the luxury cabin they were currently occupying belonged to some nameless, faceless corporate entity. They bragged relentlessly to our extended family about the $20,000 weekly rental fee as a testament to my father's untouchable generational wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the high-end real estate portfolio company managing that precise property was mine. I was not just a minor shareholder or a silent partner. I was the majority owner. Every timber, every stone fireplace, and every digital lock on every door in that Aspen estate belonged entirely to me. I spotted the flickering neon sign of a roadside diner cutting through the heavy snowfall and pulled into the empty, unplowed parking lot. I threw the car into park, but did not even bother taking off my heavy winter coat. I reached into the passenger seat, unzipped my leather briefcase, and pulled out my laptop. The diner's public Wi-Fi was incredibly weak, but it was just enough to securely access my company's internal management network. I logged into the executive property portal and pulled up the active booking logs for the Aspen region. I typed my father's last name into the search bar. The reservation file immediately populated on the screen, detailing the dates, the guest count, and the exact payment history. Charles had confidently booked the estate 3 months ago. He paid the initial deposit, securing the dates and using the booking confirmation to flaunt his lavish holiday plans to his golf buddies. But as my eyes scanned the payment ledger, a glaring red flag caught my immediate attention. The final balance for the luxury rental was due exactly 48 hours prior to check-in. The system showed that Charles had attempted to process the remaining payment using his premium platinum credit card. The transaction was declined. The card had bounced entirely. My wealthy, status-obsessed father had insufficient funds to cover the rest of his own family vacation. Under normal operational circumstances, my management company operates with a strict but polite grace period. High-net-worth clients occasionally experience banking holds or automated fraud alerts when traveling across state lines, so our standard protocol is to allow a 48-hour window to resolve any declined transactions. We usually dispatch a friendly concierge to the property to gently remind the guests about the billing error and offer assistance in updating their payment method. But normal circumstances do not apply to people who gladly throw their own flesh and blood into a dangerous blizzard. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, my regional property manager for the entire Colorado area. He answered on the second ring, sounding completely surprised to hear from the CEO directly on a holiday weekend. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. I gave him the property address and instructed him to pull up the reservation file immediately. I asked him to verify the payment status. Marcus confirmed that the final payment had indeed failed and mentioned he was planning to reach out to the guest in the morning to quietly and discreetly resolve it. I told him to scrap that protocol right now. I ordered Marcus to enforce the absolute strictest interpretation of our rental contract. A failed payment meant an invalid reservation, and an invalid reservation meant they were trespassing. I told him to dispatch local security to the cabin immediately. He was to cancel the booking in the system remotely, lock the digital keypads on all the doors, and physically evict the occupants for fraud and failure to pay. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, nervously reminding me that there was a severe blizzard outside, and the guests had a small child with them. I replied with cold, unwavering precision. I told him that those guests made their choices and they could figure out their own emergency accommodations. I demanded the eviction happen within the hour. Marcus confirmed the order, and I ended the call. A deep, steady sense of absolute satisfaction washed over me. I closed my laptop, put the car back in drive, and continued down the mountain toward the main town. 2 hours later, I was safely checked into a luxury suite at a boutique hotel nestled in the valley. I had just stepped out of a steaming hot shower, wrapping myself in a thick, warm, white robe. The winter storm continued to rage violently outside my window, but my room was perfectly warm, safe, and silent. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and walked over to the mahogany nightstand where I had left my phone. The screen was practically vibrating off the table. It lit up continuously with a rapid stream of incoming alerts. I picked it up and stared at the notifications. I had exactly 40 missed calls, 12 from my father, 15 from my mother Catherine, 13 from my sister Brittany. Mixed in were dozens of frantic, panicked text messages. The tone of their messages shifted rapidly from arrogant demands to absolute terror as they realized what was happening. The untouchable Golden family had just been forcefully thrown out into the freezing snow by security guards, and they were now desperately trying to reach the very daughter they had discarded just 2 hours prior. I sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed in my heated hotel suite, staring down at the glowing screen of my phone. The device vibrated violently against my palm. The names flashed in rapid succession. Catherine, Charles, Brittany, Donovan. Over and over again they cycled through a desperate chorus of people who had just realized they were no longer in control. I watched the missed call counter tick past 40. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. Finally, on the 41st attempt when my mother's name appeared once more, I swiped my thumb across the screen and accepted the call. I did not even have a chance to say hello. Catherine's voice exploded through the speaker, a shrill, hysterical shriek that forced me to hold the phone away from my ear. She screamed incoherently, her words drowned by the howling winter wind in the background. She wailed that a private security team had just showed up and forced them out of the luxury cabin. She cried about how humiliating it was to be escorted off the property like common criminals while the neighbors watched from their windows. They were currently standing in the frozen driveway, surrounded by their expensive luggage, trapped in the middle of a massive whiteout blizzard. Catherine sobbed about the baby being cold and complained bitterly that every single luxury hotel in Aspen was completely booked for the holiday weekend. They had absolutely nowhere to go. I listened to her panic with profound calm, remembering all the times I was left out in the cold by this exact group of people. Catherine demanded that I immediately use my credit card to secure them a private rental, fully assuming I would just fold and obey her commands like the dutiful, obedient scapegoat I had always been. Before I could even formulate a response to her absurd demand, I heard a loud scuffle on the other end of the line. The phone rustled violently, and Donovan snatched the receiver from my mother's hands. His deep voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with his usual entitled arrogance. Donovan did not ask for my help. He commanded it. He told me to turn my vehicle around this instant and drive back up the treacherous mountain road. He stated that my four-wheel drive SUV was the only car large enough to safely transport his family and their designer luggage down to the city of Denver. He then had the absolute audacity to blame me for their eviction. He claimed that my negative energy and terrible attitude had cursed their entire vacation. Donovan insisted that if I had just accepted the air mattress in the freezing basement with a grateful smile, the universe would not be punishing them with this logistical nightmare. He spoke to me as if I were a hired chauffeur who had missed a scheduled pickup time, barking orders with zero regard for my safety in the blizzard. He told me I had exactly 40 minutes to arrive at the cabin driveway, or he would hold me personally responsible for his child catching a cold. He yelled that family members are supposed to fix things when accidents happen, and that I owed them for ruining the festive mood earlier that afternoon. I let him finish his arrogant rant. I let the silence stretch for 5 long, agonizing seconds, allowing him to hear the quiet, steady rhythm of my breathing. The contrast between my perfectly warm, safe hotel room and his freezing, chaotic reality was incredibly satisfying. When I finally spoke, my voice was ice cold and perfectly level. I calmly informed Donovan that I was not his personal driver, I was not his emergency bank account, and I was certainly not his savior. I told him that my vehicle was currently parked in a secured, heated garage, and that it had absolutely zero space for people who treat me like disposable garbage. I reminded him that real families do not force their daughters to sleep on concrete floors while celebrating their own comfort. Donovan stuttered, completely shocked by my blatant defiance. He was so used to bulldozing over people that my firm boundary left him speechless. He quickly recovered and started to yell a threat about calling my father to put me in my place, but I did not let him finish the sentence. I told him to enjoy the snowstorm, pulled the phone away from my face, and firmly pressed the red button to end the call. Immediately, I opened my phone settings. I selected Donovan's contact profile and blocked his number. I did the same for Brittany. I blocked Catherine. Finally, I blocked Charles. A beautiful, profound silence descended upon my hotel room. For the first time in 33 years, I had completely severed their access to me. Fast forward 3 weeks later. The frozen mountains of Aspen were a distant memory. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my modern penthouse in downtown Seattle. The sprawling city skyline glittered brilliantly beneath me, a testament to the life I had built entirely on my own. I held a warm mug of black coffee, watching the large ferries glide smoothly across the dark waters of the Puget Sound. My life was peaceful, highly organized, and wonderfully devoid of my family's toxic drama. I had spent the last 21 days scaling my data analytics firm and finalizing major corporate acquisitions. My secure luxury building required a specialized keycard for entry, keeping any unwanted visitors far away from my sanctuary. The digital intercom on my wall chimed softly, breaking the quiet morning silence. It was the building concierge calling from the ground floor lobby. He politely informed me that a courier had just dropped off a piece of certified mail that required my direct signature. He sent the thick envelope up through the private elevator to my foyer. I signed and retrieved it. The return address belonged to the family estate. It arrived from my father, Charles. I sliced open the thick envelope with a sleek silver letter opener. The heavy cream-colored paper inside bore my father's official corporate letterhead, a pretentious touch Charles always used when he wanted to intimidate someone. I unfolded the document on my marble kitchen island, taking a slow sip of my black coffee. It was not a letter. It was an invoice disguised as a legal threat. Charles was demanding exactly $30,000. According to his typed tirade, my sudden selfish departure from the Aspen cabin had triggered a catastrophic chain of events. Because I had maliciously abandoned my own blood in the middle of a blizzard, the property management company had allegedly made a terrible administrative error and forced them out. He claimed my bad attitude was the root cause of their eviction. To survive the freezing night, My father wrote that he was forced to book 3 executive suites at the only available 5-star resort in the valley, paying exorbitant peak holiday rates. He was holding me financially responsible for his entire emergency hotel bill. The second paragraph contained the ultimatum. Charles stated that I had 2 choices. I could wire the $30,000 directly to his account by the end of the week, or I could attend the annual family Christmas dinner and deliver a formal public apology to Brittany and Donovan for ruining their vacation. If I refused to do either, he would officially disown me. He threatened to cut me off from the family permanently and write me out of his will entirely. I read the words twice, letting the sheer absurdity of his arrogance wash over me. Charles had spent my entire life using his wallet as a weapon. Growing up, I watched him control my mother and manipulate my sister by threatening to withhold their allowances or cancel their credit cards. He genuinely believed that the threat of losing an inheritance would bring me crawling back to Boston on my knees, begging for his forgiveness. He was attempting to financially strong-arm a woman whose data analytics firm was currently preparing for an $85 million valuation. He was threatening to cut me off from a pie I had outgrown a decade ago. I did not cry. I did not throw my coffee mug across the room. I just laughed, a cold, sharp laugh that echoed in the empty penthouse. Instead of getting angry, I got to work. I walked over to the paper shredder, fed my father's ridiculous ultimatum into the grinding blades, and opened my laptop. I pulled up my secure communication channel and dialed Marcus. Marcus was my lead forensic accountant, a brilliant, relentless financial predator who could find a hidden penny in a billionaire's offshore account. He answered on the first ring. I told Marcus I needed a comprehensive, discreet background check on 2 specific targets. First, I wanted him to tear into Donovan's boutique brokerage firm. Donovan had spent the last 5 years strutting around family gatherings in custom-tailored suits, bragging loudly about his high-yield investment strategies and untouchable market instincts. My mother constantly praised him, holding him up as the gold standard of success while belittling my tech career. But people who are truly pulling in massive returns do not throw a tantrum over a $30,000 hotel bill. Truly wealthy men just pay the invoice and move on. Donovan was overcompensating, and I wanted to know exactly why. My second target was Charles. I instructed Marcus to pull every available public record, property deed, and corporate filing tied to my father's name. I wanted a full stress test on his current business holdings and his personal retirement portfolios. Marcus asked me what specific anomaly we were hunting for. I told him to look for the lie. I explained that when arrogant men start making loud, desperate demands for cash and public apologies, it means their foundation is cracking. I authorized Marcus to utilize every corporate intelligence resource at our disposal. I wanted their financial lives dissected down to the bone. I closed my laptop and went about my day, attending board meetings and approving software updates for my clients. I pushed Charles and Donovan completely out of my mind, knowing Marcus would not stop digging until he struck concrete. It took exactly 22 hours. I was standing on my glass-walled balcony the next morning watching the gray Seattle rain batter the city streets when my private line rang. It was Marcus. I swiped to answer, expecting a preliminary update. Instead, Marcus sounded completely breathless. He told me he did not just find a minor discrepancy or a hidden debt. He had uncovered a catastrophic financial crater. Marcus explained that he had managed to track the movement of Charles's primary retirement accounts. My father had spent 40 years building a massive nest egg, constantly boasting about his ironclad financial security. But according to the data Marcus had just pulled, that money was gone. Over the past 18 months, Charles's accounts had been quietly and aggressively liquidated. Millions of dollars had been wiped out, entirely vaporized, in a series of highly leveraged, incredibly reckless cryptocurrency trades and terrible margin calls. I stood frozen on the balcony, the cold wind whipping my hair. I asked Marcus how a conservative, old-school businessman like Charles could possibly lose everything on volatile day trading without realizing it. Marcus dropped the final devastating piece of the puzzle. Charles did not make the trades. The broker managing those specific doomed accounts was Donovan. Donovan's digital authorization signature was stamped on every single disastrous transfer. My arrogant brother-in-law had been illegally siphoning my father's life savings to cover his own massive market losses, gambling away the family fortune while pretending to be a Wall Street genius. My father was functionally broke. Donovan was secretly drowning in fraud. Neither of them had any idea that their entire house of cards was collapsing. And most importantly, neither of them realized that the daughter they had just threatened to disinherit was now holding the matches ready to burn their beautiful facade straight to the ground. Marcus had meticulously prepared and sent over a massive digital fortress of highly encrypted files. I sat at my kitchen island, the cold marble grounding me as I opened the first dossier. The numbers told a story of absolute unmitigated greed. It was not a simple miscalculation. It was a hemorrhage. My arrogant father had a massive home equity line of credit tied directly to the sprawling historic Beacon Hill estate, a financial safety net he often bragged about but swore he would never touch. Donovan had touched it. Donovan had bled it dry. The bank statements revealed a relentless series of wire transfers moving from Charles's equity line straight into Donovan's offshore trading accounts. My brother-in-law had been chasing crypto highs, day trading with reckless abandon, and losing massively. Every time the market dipped, Donovan panicked, siphoning another 50,000, then another 100,000, trying to cover his margin calls. He was drowning in his own arrogance, and Brittany was happily holding his head underwater. The secondary ledgers showed where the rest of the stolen equity was going. Brittany was bleeding the accounts just as fast as her husband. The transaction history was a sickening display of vanity. There were charges for designer handbags, spontaneous weekend trips to Milan, and custom diamond tennis bracelets. She was swiping my father's stolen equity to maintain the illusion of her perfect, untouchable lifestyle. They were living like royalty on stolen money. Stolen money. Stolen money from a father who was too blind to see the theft. They were thieves dressed in cashmere. They were parasites feeding on the host. Charles and Catherine were completely oblivious. They were entirely blinded by their obsessive love for their golden child. Brittany could do no wrong. Donovan was the brilliant financial prodigy they always wanted. They willingly handed over power of attorney for their secondary accounts so Donovan could optimize their yields. They handed him the keys to the vault, and he drove a truck right through it. The absolute ignorance of my parents was staggering. They spent their days judging my career, mocking my independence, and praising the very people who were actively robbing them blind. They praised the thieves. They worshipped the thieves. They celebrated the exact people who were destroying their entire financial future. I stared at the screen, a cold smile forming on my face. The $30,000 extortion letter sitting in my trash can suddenly made perfect sense. Charles did not just want an apology. He was desperate for liquid cash. He needed my money to plug the holes in his sinking ship, completely unaware that his beloved son-in-law was the one drilling the holes. He was demanding a ransom from his successful daughter to fund the lavish lifestyle of his treacherous golden child. The sheer audacity was almost poetic. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Seattle skyline. The upcoming family Christmas dinner was supposed to be my public execution. Charles intended to stand before our extended relatives, read my forced apology, and cement his status as the benevolent patriarch forgiving his wayward daughter. Brittany would sit there with her stolen diamonds, smirking at my humiliation. She would bask in the glow of my defeat. She would revel in my subjugation. She would play the innocent victim while wearing the spoils of her father's ruined estate. I decided right then and there that I would attend the dinner. I would not just attend. I would dismantle their entire false reality. I would tear down the facade brick by brick. The dinner would be my stage. The dinner would be their reckoning. I would let them dress up in their finest clothes, pour their expensive wine, and gather the whole family around the mahogany table. I would let them build the stage perfectly, so the fall would be that much more devastating. I would walk into that dining room and shatter the illusion they had spent a lifetime creating. I would make sure every single guest knew exactly who the real failures were. I looked back at the final page of the financial report. A red flag blared at the bottom of the screen. I leaned in my eyes, scanning the fine print. Charles's house was completely underwater. The Beacon Hill estate, the ultimate symbol of the family legacy, was leveraged beyond its maximum capacity. The bank had issued 3 consecutive notices of default. The grace periods had expired. The warnings had been ignored. The equity was gone. The grand family mansion was standing on utterly worthless ground. The financial institution was actively preparing to bundle the defaulted debt and sell it off to a third-party collection agency at a steep discount to clear their books before the end of the fiscal year. They were going to auction off my father's debt to the highest bidder. They were going to hand the keys of the family kingdom to a faceless corporation. The legacy was dead. Before I made the final call, I took one last long look at the documents. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was breathtaking. They had cast me out into a lethal winter storm, completely convinced of their own untouchable superiority. They had demanded a ransom for a perceived slight, wholly unaware that their entire financial existence was hanging by a single fragile thread. The irony was so overwhelmingly delicious that I could practically taste it on my tongue. I grabbed my phone. I bypassed Marcus and scrolled straight to the contact for my corporate acquisitions lawyer, the man who handles hostile takeovers for my portfolio. I called. He answered immediately, recognizing my private number. I told him to contact the specific bank holding the debt on the Beacon Hill estate. I instructed him to step in front of the collection agency and make a direct cash offer to purchase the entire defaulted loan portfolio. I wanted to own the debt. I wanted to own the house. I wanted to own their reality. My corporate acquisitions attorney, Arthur, operates with the kind of ruthless efficiency that makes him a terror in boardrooms and an absolute asset to my investment portfolio. Within 2 days of my initial phone call, he had orchestrated a flawless masterpiece of financial maneuvering. The bank holding the massive mortgage on my parents' sprawling Beacon Hill estate was bleeding heavily from a disastrous quarter of toxic loans. They were absolutely desperate to scrub their balance sheets clean before the fiscal year ended. They did not care who was buying the bad debt as long as the cash was liquid and the transfer was immediate. Sitting across from Arthur in his glass-walled conference room overlooking the gray, rain-soaked Seattle skyline, I watched him slide a thick stack of dense legal documents across the polished mahogany table. I was not purchasing the debt under my own name. That would tip my hand too early and ruin the impending surprise. Instead, we utilized Obsidian Holdings, a completely untraceable shell corporation buried deep within my corporate structure. Arthur tapped his heavy gold pen against the top page, confirming that the bank had eagerly accepted our cash offer for pennies on the dollar. The massive financial institution was completely washing their hands of Charles and his hopelessly defaulted loans. I picked up the pen and began to sign my name on the designated lines. With every swift stroke of black ink, the reality of the situation solidified. I was absorbing the paper that dictated my family's day-to-day survival. I was officially buying the massive roof right over their entitled heads. I paused for a fraction of a second to admire the crisp lines of my signature. For years, my family had wielded their wealth like a bludgeon, using their financial superiority to demand total obedience and absolute submission from everyone around them. They truly believed their money made them invincible gods. Now, their entire kingdom had been quietly sold off in a sterile conference room for a fraction of its original worth. The scratching sound of the pen against the heavy parchment triggered a visceral, unavoidable memory. The sensation of signing my name on a binding financial document instantly transported me back 15 years in time. I was 18 years old, standing in my father's suffocating cigar-scented study in that exact same Beacon Hill mansion. I had carefully laid my university acceptance letters and a stack of student loan applications on his massive oak desk. I had worked 3 grueling retail jobs just to save enough for the initial deposit, but I desperately needed a guarantor for the remaining tuition. I was not asking for a handout, just a simple signature to secure the educational funding. Charles had barely even glanced at the paperwork. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, steepled his fingers, and delivered a rejection so cold it practically froze my blood. He explicitly stated that investing in a woman's education was a fundamental waste of capital. He told me that my only viable path was to find a wealthy husband, and that funding an independent career for a girl who lacked the family's natural business acumen was a terrible return on investment. He slid the unsigned papers back across the desk and told me to dismiss myself. He turned his attention back to his computer monitor, completely unbothered by the fact that he had just crushed my dreams with a few callous sentences. I remembered the burning humiliation, the hot tears I violently refused to let fall, until I was safely out of the house and standing alone on the sidewalk. I had walked out of that study entirely on my own, completely financially severed from the toxic family structure. Now, 15 years later, my signature was finalizing the purchase of the very room where he had discarded me. My independent female-funded capital had just bought his entire legacy. He thought I was a bad investment. Now I was his sole proprietor. I finished the final signature and pushed the documents back across the wide table. Arthur quickly reviewed the pages, closed the leather folder, and offered a sharp, approving nod. He pressed a button on his desk phone, instructing his paralegal to initiate the wire transfer. Within 60 seconds, the transaction was fully cleared. Arthur leaned forward, folding his hands deliberately on the desk. He calmly informed me that because the mortgage was already in severe unmitigated default, the legal constraints were practically non-existent. Obsidian Holdings was now the absolute sole owner of the banknote. Arthur stated that we had the legal right to initiate the foreclosure process instantly. He offered to dispatch a courier to the courthouse immediately. He promised that we could have the local sheriff physically padlocking the heavy iron gates of the Beacon Hill estate by tomorrow morning. The vivid mental image of Charles and Catherine being forced onto the freezing curb alongside their expensive designer furniture was incredibly tempting. It would be swift, brutal, and entirely legal. But swiftness lacked the necessary theatricality. It lacked the sweet, devastating impact of a personal delivery. I looked at Arthur and smiled a genuine, chilling smile. I instructed him to draft the formal eviction notice and the official foreclosure filings. I told him to make the legal language aggressive, airtight, and completely irreversible. But I explicitly ordered him to hold the execution. We were not sending the sheriff. We were not mailing a certified warning. I leaned back in my chair, the sweet taste of absolute victory settling deep in my chest. I told Arthur that the family was hosting their grand annual Christmas dinner in exactly 5 days. My father had demanded my presence for a forced, humiliating public apology. I was going to give him exactly what he had so arrogantly asked for. I was going to gladly attend that dinner, look him dead in the eyes, and hand-deliver his total financial ruin as my ultimate Christmas gift to the people who abandoned me. The brisk morning of Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter, biting chill that mercilessly swept across the dark waters of the busy Seattle harbor. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, watching the gray clouds gather over the skyline. My mobile phone vibrated violently against the cold marble countertop of my spotless kitchen island, loudly shattering the deeply quiet sanctuary I had carefully created. I walked over and picked up the device. The screen illuminated with a text message from my sister Brittany. It was the first time she had reached out directly since I blocked her number from the hotel in Aspen, but she had apparently used Donovan's phone to bypass my restrictions. Her message was a masterpiece of absolute delusion and unmitigated entitlement. She did not offer a single word of apology for throwing me out into a lethal blizzard. Instead, she demanded that I bring a very specific, outrageously expensive bottle of vintage Bordeaux to the family dinner that evening. She stated that since my horrible, deeply selfish behavior had entirely ruined their lavish winter vacation and forced my furious father to pay for emergency hotel suites, The expensive wine would serve as an acceptable first step toward my mandatory apology. She ended the text by reminding me not to be late because Charles hated waiting for people who lacked proper time management skills. I slowly read the demanding text message twice, silently marveling at the sheer, unbridled audacity of a woman who was actively funding her designer lifestyle with stolen equity. Brittany truly believed she still held the high ground. She genuinely thought I was going to walk into our childhood home with my head bowed in shame, carrying a $2,000 bottle of wine to beg for their forgiveness. I did not reply to the message. I simply deleted the thread and tossed my phone back onto the counter. There was no need to engage in petty text arguments when I was about to drop a nuclear bomb on their entire false reality. I finished my black coffee and walked into my dressing room to prepare for the evening. For years, I had dressed defensively for family gatherings, choosing muted colors and conservative styles to avoid triggering my mother's relentless criticism or my sister's snide remarks. Tonight, I dressed for war. I bypassed the understated dresses and selected a custom-tailored dark charcoal designer suit. It was a garment that screamed quiet luxury. The fabric was immaculate, the cut was sharp and unforgiving, and the overall effect radiated absolute power and untouchable wealth. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and simple diamond studs. I looked in the mirror and saw the woman I had built myself into, a ruthless, successful executive who no longer needed to shrink to make her family comfortable. I walked back to my study and unlocked my private safe. I retrieved the sleek black leather briefcase I reserved for high-stakes corporate acquisitions. I opened the clasps and carefully packed my ammunition. First went the thick financial dossiers Marcus had meticulously compiled, detailing every single fraudulent transaction Donovan had executed to drain my father's retirement accounts. Next went the banking ledgers showing Brittany's rampant, unauthorized spending sprees. Then I placed the freshly minted, legally binding mortgage deed, proving that my corporate shell company, Obsidian Holdings, was now the sole owner of the Beacon Hill estate. Finally, I laid the formal eviction notice right on top. The legal language drafted by Arthur was airtight, aggressive, and completely irreversible. It mandated that the current occupants vacate the premises within 30 days or face immediate removal by law enforcement. I snapped the briefcase shut. The heavy metallic click echoed in the silent room. This was not a collection of papers. It was the absolute dismantling of my family's toxic kingdom. I grabbed my car keys, draped a heavy wool coat over my shoulders, and headed down to the private garage. The drive to my parents' sprawling estate was a slow crawl through heavy holiday traffic. Snow had begun to fall, dusting the streets in a thin layer of white powder. The festive atmosphere of the city stood in sharp contrast to the cold, calculating focus burning in my chest. I turned onto the familiar tree-lined street in Beacon Hill, passing the massive iron gates and immaculate lawns of the neighboring mansions. I approached my childhood home, a grand, imposing brick structure that had always felt more like a museum than a sanctuary. The long, sweeping driveway was crowded with expensive vehicles. I pulled my SUV smoothly through the open gates and immediately spotted Donovan's bright red leased Italian sports car, parked diagonally near the front entrance. The vehicle was obnoxiously positioned, taking up 2 spaces, a perfect physical representation of his overinflated ego and desperate need to project wealth he did not actually possess. He drove a car that cost more than a small house, yet he was secretly draining my father's equity line just to keep his head above water. I carefully parked my large vehicle neatly behind his, completely turned off the running engine, and slowly unbuckled my seatbelt. I sat in the quiet cabin for one final moment, watching the snow accumulate on the windshield. For my entire life, walking through those heavy oak doors meant bracing myself for an onslaught of judgment, mockery, and emotional manipulation. It meant walking into a space where my father was the undisputed king and my sister was the adored princess, while I was merely an inconvenient afterthought. But tonight, the dynamics were completely inverted. I took a very deep, steadying breath. I picked up the black leather briefcase from the passenger seat, feeling the solid weight of the documents inside. I pushed open my car door and stepped out into the freezing winter air. My expensive heels crunched softly against the freshly fallen snow. I adjusted my coat, squared my shoulders, and marched toward the front door, absolutely ready for war. I pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped into the suffocating warmth of the grand foyer. The house was a massive sensory overload of fresh pine needles, expensive cinnamon candles, and the overwhelming hum of 30 different conversations happening at once. The expansive entryway spilled directly into the formal living room, which was absolutely packed to the brim with our extended family. Aunts in glittering holiday dresses, uncles nursing dark spirits by the fireplace, and cousins trading stories around the massive professionally decorated Christmas tree. It was the exact same theatrical display my parents put on every single year. It was a perfect glittering stage specifically designed to mask the deep financial rot spreading underneath the floorboards. I handed my heavy wool coat to the hired staff, but kept my grip firmly on the black leather briefcase. I had barely taken 3 steps into the main hallway when the ambush occurred. My mother, Catherine, materialized out of the thick crowd like a heat-seeking missile. She wore a floor-length emerald gown and a smile so tight it looked physically painful. She did not offer a warm hug. She did not say a simple hello. Her sharp eyes instantly darted to my empty hands and then snapped down to the briefcase. She loudly sighed a highly practiced sound designed specifically to draw the immediate attention of my aunt standing nearby. She demanded to know where the expensive vintage Bordeaux was. I told her plainly that I did not bring it. The fake smile dropped completely from her face, instantly replaced by a mask of manufactured disappointment. She turned to Aunt Miriam and Aunt Clara, shaking her head tragically, as if I had just committed an unforgivable crime. She announced to them, and to anyone else within earshot, that I had maliciously ruined Brittany's Aspen vacation and now refused to even offer a simple basic gesture of apology. Catherine's voice climbed an octave intentionally, ensuring the public shaming reached the back of the crowded room. She lamented extensively about my supposed selfishness. She told the wide-eyed aunts that she simply did not understand how a daughter of hers could be so incredibly stingy and bitter. She waved a dismissive manicured hand at my briefcase, loudly asking why I was bringing a drab, depressing work bag to a festive family Christmas party. She loudly complained that I was hopelessly obsessed with my dead-end tech job, working myself to the bone for a meager salary, while my sister Brittany was effortlessly building a beautiful, highly successful family. Catherine praised Brittany's flawless maternal instincts, her beautiful home, and her brilliant husband, painting a vivid picture of absolute perfection, while actively tearing me down to the studs in front of our own blood relatives. I stood completely still in the center of the hallway, letting her venomous words wash right over me. I did not flinch. I did not try to defend my career. I did not mention the $85 million valuation of my data analytics firm. I just watched her perform her predictable script. Every single insult she hurled was another nail in her own coffin. She was desperately clinging to a social hierarchy that no longer existed, worshiping a lavish lifestyle that I had legally purchased just 48 hours ago. The aunts murmured sympathetically, offering me looks of deep, patronizing pity. They actually believed Catherine. They genuinely believed I was the tragic, lonely spinster struggling to make ends meet, completely unaware that the black briefcase clutched in my hand held the actual deed to the very floor they were standing on. They thought I was a failure because my mother told them I was. I just smiled a cold, empty smile, letting them dig their graves deeper with every passing second. The crowd parted slightly, and Donovan swaggered into the hallway. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet dinner jacket and holding a heavy crystal glass of expensive scotch. His face was slightly flushed, either from the alcohol or the sheer thrill of his own perceived brilliance. He had the unmistakable toxic aura of a man who firmly thought he was the smartest person in any room he walked into. He stopped right beside Catherine, throwing a heavy, possessive arm around her shoulders in a show of unified dominance against me. He looked down at me with a sickeningly smug grin that made my blood run cold. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking loudly in the tense hallway. He told my mother not to be too hard on me. He stated that people stuck in the lower-tier tech sector simply did not understand how to properly manage their limited discretionary income. He raised his voice further, projecting his arrogant tone, ensuring the entire formal living room could hear his mockery. The lively conversations around the Christmas tree began to rapidly die down. The uncles turned their heads from the fireplace. The cousins stopped laughing. The room grew unnervingly quiet as Donovan stepped fully into the spotlight, basking in the absolute attention of the extended family. He clearly loved an audience. He craved the admiration of people who thought he was a financial genius. He tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon, a sharp ringing sound that demanded total silence from the room. He announced that since it was the joyous season of giving, he wanted to offer a very special, highly educational gift to the family's most struggling, misguided member. He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with sheer, unadulterated arrogance as a smirk played on his lips. He told the completely silent room that he had some crucial financial advice for poor little Sloane. Donovan stood in the center of the formal living room, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He puffed out his chest, soaking up the attentive silence of our extended family. The firelight caught the expensive fabric of his tailored velvet jacket as he pointed a manicured finger in my direction. He began by lamenting the terrible state of the modern economy, spinning a fabricated narrative about how difficult it must be for a single woman trying to run a little tech startup. He actually used the phrase little tech startup with a sickeningly sympathetic tone. He told the room that he had recently spoken with his partners at the brokerage firm and decided to extend an act of pure familial charity. He formally offered me a low-level administrative position at his company. He stated that managing incoming client calls and organizing physical filing cabinets would provide me with the steady, reliable paycheck I so desperately needed. He paused to let the sheer magnanimity of his fake offer wash over the crowd. He genuinely expected me to weep with gratitude right there on the Persian rug. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, letting his eyes roam over the faces of my aunts and uncles before locking his gaze back onto me. He leaned casually against the polished mahogany mantel and delivered his next insult with precision. He stated that it was a documented historical fact that women who attempted to build independent businesses entirely on their own almost always failed. He claimed that the brutal, unforgiving nature of the corporate world simply chewed up naive girls who lacked the necessary masculine grit and aggressive market instincts. He practically shouted that true wealth was built through highly leveraged portfolios and aggressive crypto trading, not by tapping away on a keyboard in a lonely apartment. He told the silent room that he was offering me a lifeline, a chance to step out of my delusional fantasy and join a real financial institution. He actually told me that if I worked hard enough answering his phones, he might even teach me how to balance a basic checkbook so I would not end up completely destitute by the age of 40. The room remained perfectly quiet, everyone waiting for my reaction when Brittany suddenly stepped out from the shadows near the towering Christmas tree. She glided across the room in a sparkling floor-length silver gown, the stolen diamonds glittering brightly around her wrists and neck. She wrapped her arm around Donovan's waist, resting her head against his shoulder, to present the ultimate picture of marital success and untouchable wealth. She looked at me with an expression of deep manufactured pity that made my skin crawl. She told the surrounding cousins and aunts that everyone simply needed to forgive my constant sour mood. She loudly declared that I was just terribly bitter because I could not afford the spectacular, luxurious lifestyle she and Donovan enjoyed. She explicitly stated that my financial inadequacy made me jealous of their incredible success. She then flawlessly pivoted the conversation to their recent disastrous winter vacation in the mountains. She lied to the entire room without a single ounce of hesitation or shame. Brittany projected her voice clearly so that every single relative could hear her fabricated tale of winter survival. She claimed that their abrupt departure from the luxury Aspen cabin had absolutely nothing to do with my sudden exit. Instead, she spun a dramatic, entirely fictional story about how the ancient plumbing in the property had catastrophically failed. She claimed the pipes had frozen completely solid in the middle of the night, bursting and flooding the lower levels of the cabin with freezing water. She dramatically placed a hand over her heart, telling Aunt Miriam how terrifying it was to be trapped in a freezing, unlivable house during a massive blizzard. She praised Donovan's quick thinking and Charles's immense generosity for securing 3 executive suites at a 5-star resort so they would not freeze to death. She completely erased the reality that I owned that cabin, that I had kicked them out for their toxic behavior, and that the property management company had explicitly blacklisted them. She painted herself as a brave survivor and me as the jealous, absent sister who had missed out on a grand family adventure. I stood perfectly still, my hand gripping the handle of my black leather briefcase. The heavy polished leather contained the exact undeniable proof that Donovan was a monumental fraud who had secretly vaporized my father's life savings. It held the bank ledgers proving Brittany was funding her sparkling gowns with stolen home equity. It contained the legally binding absolute proof that I now exclusively owned the very ground they were standing on. I did not scream. I did not rush forward to defend my honor or expose their blatant lies. I simply smiled, a calm, chilling smile. I reached over to a passing waiter, picked up a crystal glass of ice water, and took a slow, deliberate sip. I looked directly into Donovan's arrogant eyes and smoothly agreed that financial stability was indeed incredibly important. I told him I completely agreed that knowing exactly where your money was at all times was the absolute key to survival. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, utterly captivated by the strange psychological warfare unfolding right before their eyes. Before Donovan could process the sharp underlying threat in my calm tone, the heavy, commanding sound of a spoon clinking sharply against crystal cut through the thick tension in the room. Charles stood at the far end of the grand hall, his posture rigid and authoritative. He loudly cleared his throat, silencing the remaining murmurs. He announced that it was time for everyone to move into the formal dining room for dinner. He then stated with absolute unyielding authority that he had a major family announcement to make before the first course was served. The mass migration to the formal dining room felt like a choreographed procession. The extended family moved in a glittering wave, buzzing with whispers about Charles and his impending announcement. I followed at the rear, the black leather briefcase a comforting weight in my hand. The dining room was an overwhelming display of orchestrated wealth. A massive crystal chandelier cast a golden glow over a table long enough to seat 40 people. The mahogany surface was completely buried under a display of festive excess, featuring towering floral centerpieces, heavy silver candelabras, and delicate bone china trimmed in actual gold. Beautiful place cards written in sweeping calligraphy dictated the rigid social hierarchy of the room. I walked slowly down the table, searching for my name. Charles and Catherine commanded the heads of the table like monarchs. Brittany and Donovan were seated in the absolute positions of honor to Charles's right, flanked by the wealthiest aunts. I kept walking past the successful cousins until I reached the very end of the room. My place card sat in front of the worst seat in the house. It was shoved into the narrow, drafty corner directly next to the swinging door leading into the kitchen. When a waiter rushed past, a blast of cold air and the clatter of pots washed over the chair. It was Catherine's way of ensuring I knew I was a complete afterthought placed far from power. I did not complain or ask to move. I pulled out the heavy wooden seat and sat down, placing my briefcase squarely on the floor between my feet, pressing my calf against the smooth leather to ensure it remained safe. I smoothed my napkin over my lap and looked straight down the table. From this vantage point, I had an unobstructed view of the toxic ecosystem. I watched the waiters pour expensive red wine into crystal goblets. I watched the aunts lean in to compliment Brittany on her stolen diamonds. I watched Donovan laugh aggressively at a joke Charles had not finished telling. They were entirely wrapped up in their delusions of grandeur, celebrating an empire currently resting against my right leg in the form of a foreclosure notice. The first course arrived in a flurry of service. Plates of roasted squash soup were placed before each guest. the room filled with the soft clinking of silver spoons against porcelain and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter. I ate in total silence, savoring the rich flavors, while the noise of the kitchen staff periodically blasted through the swinging door beside me. The physical distance from my parents gave me a strange sense of peace. I was detached from their reality, simply waiting for the inevitable climax of their performance. During the main course, the ambient noise began to fade. Charles slowly rose from his carved wooden chair at the far end of the room. He picked up his crystal wine glass and tapped the side of it with his silver knife. The sharp, ringing sound instantly severed every single conversation. The aunts stopped chewing, the uncles putting down their drinks. All eyes snapped to the patriarch of the family. Charles stood tall, his posture rigidly straight, projecting an aura of absolute authority. He smoothed the lapels of his dark navy suit and let his severe gaze sweep across the assembled relatives. He began speaking with a resonant voice, thanking everyone for gathering to celebrate the holiday season. He quickly transitioned into his favorite subject, the sacred concept of the family legacy. Charles spoke passionately about the relentless sacrifice it took to build his real estate empire from the ground up. He painted a vivid picture of his early struggles, reminding everyone of the years he spent grinding for every dollar, building a dynasty designed to outlast them all. He then turned his body slightly, placing a heavy, affectionate hand on Donovan's shoulder. Charles boldly proclaimed that looking at Donovan and Brittany filled him with an immense sense of pride. He called them the pinnacle of success, praising their business acumen and dedication to family values. He stated that Donovan possessed the exact same ruthless drive and financial brilliance he himself had utilized to build his fortune. He called Brittany the perfect anchor, a woman who understood the vital importance of maintaining the family image. He looked at them with a warmth he had never once directed toward me. Then Charles's expression hardened. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, judgmental glare. He slowly turned his head, his gaze traveling down the table until it locked directly onto me, sitting alone in the drafty corner by the kitchen door. The entire room physically shifted following his line of sight. Dozens of eyes stared at me in unison. Charles raised his voice, ensuring the condemnation reached the back walls. He stated that a true legacy requires absolute loyalty and unbreakable strength. He sneered, declaring that true success is earned through resilience, unlike some people who run away at the exact first sign of hardship. He practically spat the words, condemning anyone who would abandon their family duties to chase foolish tech dreams on the other side of the country. He paused, letting the suffocating silence amplify his public insult. I held his furious gaze without blinking. I did not shrink down in my chair. I simply maintained my calm, empty smile. Charles straightened his shoulders, tearing his eyes away from me to address the room. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. His fingers emerged, holding a thick, perfectly folded legal document printed on heavy ivory paper. He held it up slightly, allowing the dining room chandelier to illuminate the official seals stamped across the front. He took a deep breath, his voice echoing in the dead silence. He announced to the assembled family that in order to permanently protect his life's work from those who do not deserve it, he had officially updated his last will and testament. Charles held the heavy ivory paper high enough for the crystal chandelier to catch the embossed gold seal. The dining room was so quiet, I could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock. He slowly lowered the document, resting it on the polished mahogany table. He flattened the crisp creases with the palm of his hand, a deliberate theatrical motion designed to draw out the agonizing suspense. My aunts leaned forward in their chairs, completely breathless, while my cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. Charles cleared his throat again, letting the booming sound vibrate against the fine china. He stated that a legacy of our magnitude required custodians who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, impeccable judgment, and a profound respect for family unity. He glared down the long table, directly at me, ensuring every single person in the room followed his line of sight. He announced with a booming, authoritative voice that effective immediately he was executing a complete restructuring of his estate. He stated that the traditional division of assets among his children was a luxury reserved for those who actually participated in the family dynamic. He declared without a single trace of hesitation or regret that Sloane was officially and permanently cut out of the inheritance. He let the finality of those words hang in the heavy air. He emphasized that I would not receive a single dime from his accounts. He systematically listed the assets being reallocated, making sure the sheer volume of wealth was fully understood. The domestic and international investment portfolios, the massive commercial real estate holdings, and the sprawling Beacon Hill estate we were currently sitting inside. Every single asset, every dollar, every piece of property was to be transferred entirely to Brittany and Donovan. The collective gasp from the extended family swept through the dining room like a sudden gust of wind. Aunt Miriam dropped her heavy silver fork, letting it clatter against her porcelain plate. Uncle Arthur gripped his napkin, looking between Charles and me with absolute shock. Donovan leaned back in his ornate chair, a sickeningly triumphant grin spreading across his face. He wrapped his arm tightly around Brittany, pulling her close in a victorious embrace. Brittany beamed, looking around the table as if she had just won a prize rather than simply manipulating her way into a stolen fortune. She tried to feign a look of solemn responsibility, but the pure, unadulterated greed shining in her eyes gave her away completely. Charles nodded at them, a look of profound paternal pride replacing the cold fury he had directed at me. He told the room that Brittany and Donovan had proven their absolute worthiness to carry the family name into the next generation. Before the shock could even begin to settle among the aunts and uncles, Catherine seized her opportunity to strike. She stood up from her chair, resting her hands firmly on the table, her emerald gown catching the light. She looked down the table at me, with a gaze so full of venom it could have stripped paint from the walls. She told the gasping relatives this disinheritance was the direct consequence of my own horrific actions. She raised her voice, ensuring her absolute indignation commanded the room. Catherine declared that my complete lack of morality had been exposed during our winter vacation in Aspen. She twisted the narrative with terrifying skill, completely omitting the part where I owned the cabin and they had destroyed it. Instead, she claimed that I had maliciously abandoned my own family in the middle of a lethal blizzard, leaving them stranded and freezing. Catherine was just getting started. She pointed a manicured finger at me and told the wide-eyed aunts that I had subsequently refused to pay a $30,000 invoice for the emergency resort accommodations they were forced to secure. She framed my refusal as an act of unprecedented cruelty. She asked the room how a daughter could look at her shivering, desperate family and completely deny them basic shelter. She answered her own question, stating that only a sociopath could behave with such callous disregard for human life. She loudly labeled me a total disgrace to the family name, a selfish, bitter woman who cared more about hoarding her meager tech salary than ensuring the safety of her own blood. She told the cousins that I had brought this ultimate punishment entirely upon myself through my own toxic independence and sheer arrogance. She finished her tirade by looking at me with pure disgust, stating that I no longer deserved the privilege of sitting at their table. The dining room plunged into a suffocating dead silence. The tension was so thick it felt like physical pressure crushing down on my chest. Nobody moved. Nobody took a breath. Dozens of eyes were locked onto my face, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They fully expected me to burst into hysterical tears. They were waiting for me to leap from my chair, beg for forgiveness, and frantically promise to pay the $30,000 invoice to win back my father's favor. They wanted me to run away in absolute shame, humiliated and broken by my ultimate expulsion from the family kingdom. I looked down the long expanse of mahogany, meeting the smug, victorious stares of Charles, Catherine, Brittany, and Donovan. I did not shed a single tear. I did not beg. I simply reached for my crisp white linen napkin and calmly wiped the corners of my mouth. I placed the napkin neatly beside my half-empty plate of soup. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor, and slowly stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. I took one final deep, stabilizing breath, letting the icy air from the kitchen door wash over my shoulders. I reached down and firmly closed my right hand around the familiar solid handle of my black leather briefcase, absolutely ready to drop the final bomb. I stood tall at the far end of the long mahogany table, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the black leather briefcase in my right hand. The deafening silence in the formal dining room stretched on for several agonizing seconds. Every single aunt, uncle, and cousin was completely paralyzed, their eyes darting frantically between my father's triumphant, sneering face and my perfectly calm demeanor. They were all collectively holding their breath, waiting for the dramatic, tearful implosion that Catherine and Charles had so carefully orchestrated. They expected a total breakdown. They expected me to flee the room in absolute humiliation. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh that echoed brightly against the crystal chandelier. The sound was so entirely out of place, so entirely devoid of the devastation they anticipated, that Charles actually flinched. His smug expression faltered, a brief flash of utter confusion crossing his severe aging features. I looked directly into his cold eyes and told him that keeping his money was unequivocally the best financial decision he had ever made in his entire life. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring the quiet authority in my tone easily carried across the vast expanse of the formal dining room. I told my father that he needed to hold on to that updated will very tightly, because in a very short amount of time, he was going to desperately need every single penny he had left to his name, just to keep a roof over his head. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled relatives. Catherine's mouth fell open in sheer outrage, her manicured hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck by my absolute defiance. Charles slammed his fist down onto the table, rattling the fine bone china and sloshing expensive red wine onto the immaculate white tablecloth. He opened his mouth to shout another barrage of furious insults, ready to demand my immediate removal from his home. Before he could formulate a single word, I placed the heavy briefcase flat onto the dining table. The sharp metallic snap of the brass clasps popping open cut through the rising tension like a gunshot. I reached inside and pulled out a crisp, glossy copy of the most recent issue of Forbes magazine. I held it up for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the bright overhead lights to catch the cover before throwing it down the center of the table. The thick magazine slid smoothly across the polished mahogany, gliding past the towering floral centerpieces and the silver candelabras, until it came to a perfect halt directly in front of Charles and Catherine. Staring up at them from the glossy cover was a high-resolution, full-page portrait of my face. The bold, oversized text printed directly beneath my image read, "The Quiet Architect of the Data Revolution." I watched as my father's eyes dropped to the cover. I watched his highly rigid brain struggle to process the image of his discarded, supposedly failed daughter gracing the front of the most prestigious financial publication in the world. I did not give him a chance to recover from the initial blow. I announced to the completely paralyzed room that my data analytics firm, the little tech project my family had mocked and belittled for nearly a decade, had just closed a massive acquisition deal. I stated clearly and proudly that my company was officially valued at $85 million. The sheer magnitude of that number dropped into the dining room like a live grenade. The aunts who had just been whispering their patronizing pity were now staring at me in absolute wide-eyed horror. $85 million. It was a figure that entirely dwarfed the total valuation of Charles's precious manufacturing empire. It was a level of wealth that made Donovan's leased Italian sports car and Brittany's stolen diamonds look like cheap children's toys. I let the massive number hang in the heavy air, watching it systematically destroy the false hierarchy my parents had spent my entire life building. I told Charles that I did not care about his inheritance because I could buy his entire company in cash tomorrow and liquidate it just for the sheer entertainment value. The immediate physical reaction at the head of the table was nothing short of glorious. Brittany, who had been glowing with unearned superiority just moments prior, turned completely ashen. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking sickly and terrified. The smug, victorious smile was entirely wiped away, replaced by the crushing realization that her entire identity as the wealthy, successful golden child had just been permanently obliterated. She looked frantically at Donovan, desperately seeking reassurance, but Donovan was already unraveling. His face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He shifted his weight nervously, the velvet of his dinner jacket suddenly looking absurdly tacky. He let out a loud, high-pitched scoff that sounded incredibly pathetic in the quiet room. He pointed a shaking finger at the magazine and stammered that it was obviously a ridiculous public relations stunt. He loudly proclaimed to the cousins that anyone could buy a magazine cover these days, desperately insisting that the valuation was entirely fake news. He frantically tried to assure the room that tech valuations were just imaginary numbers on a screen, completely desperate to maintain his crumbling facade as the smartest financial mind in the family. I did not argue with his pathetic display of fragile ego. I did not raise my voice or try to defend the undeniable reality of my absolute success. I simply smiled again, a sharp, predatory smile that made Donovan immediately stop talking. I reached back into the open leather briefcase and pulled out the second item on my agenda. I retrieved the thick, heavy manila folder containing the meticulous financial dossiers Marcus had compiled. The thick stack of papers held the absolute truth of Donovan's rampant embezzlement and Brittany's catastrophic unauthorized spending. I held the heavy folder in my hand, feeling the solid weight of their impending destruction. I looked dead into Donovan's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him that since he was so incredibly concerned about fake numbers, we were going to move on to a different topic. I tossed the thick folder onto the table with a heavy, satisfying thud. I told Donovan that we were absolutely done talking about fake news, and it was time to discuss the real news. I flipped open the heavy manila folder, letting the crisp pages settle against the polished mahogany table. The room was so silent you could hear the soft rustle of the paper. I did not look at my parents. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Donovan. I read aloud the exact routing number of Charles's primary offshore holding account. I followed it immediately with the secondary account number, the one Charles mistakenly believed was secure. Donovan swallowed hard, his throat bobbing nervously against his incredibly tight collar. I read the numbers clearly articulating every single digit, so they echoed in the cavernous dining room. I announced that starting exactly 14 months ago, a series of highly irregular transfers began bleeding these accounts dry. I watched Donovan's hands begin to tremble. He tried to shove them into his pockets, but the tremor was already obvious to anyone paying attention. I stated that the funds were not being directed into legitimate investments or family trusts. Instead, they were being funneled directly into a series of shell companies registered under a highly obscured corporate entity. I read the name of the entity aloud, noting how it conveniently shared the exact same registered agent as Donovan's failing boutique investment firm. I turned to the next page in the dossier. I informed the table that when the offshore liquid assets dried up, Donovan did not stop. He simply pivoted his strategy. I looked directly at Charles, who was gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. I told my father that the man sitting beside him had secretly leveraged the Beacon Hill estate. I revealed that Donovan had illegally opened a massive home equity line of credit against the very roof over our heads. The gasps from the extended family were louder this time. Uncle Arthur muttered a sharp curse under his breath. I listed the transaction histories with brutal precision. I detailed the exact dates and the massive sums withdrawn. $500,000 in April, another $300,000 in June. I explained exactly where that money had gone. I laid out the staggering, catastrophic losses Donovan had suffered in highly volatile cryptocurrency markets. I detailed how he had tried to chase his losses, throwing good money after bad, completely liquidating my father's equity to cover his margin calls. I did not stop there. I pulled out a highlighted spreadsheet and slammed it on top of the pile. I announced that while Charles was bleeding equity, Donovan was busy treating himself. I read off the monthly lease payments for the imported Italian sports car currently sitting in the driveway. I detailed the exclusive golf club memberships and the lavish trips to Dubai, all completely funded by the forged lines of credit. I told Donovan that his entire image of success was built on a foundation of my father's stolen money. Brittany tried to interject, her voice high and panicked. She demanded that I stop talking, insisting that Donovan was a financial genius and that I was just jealous. I turned my attention to my sister, letting a cold, humorless smile cross my face. I told Brittany she should probably sit down and listen because she was just as deeply implicated as her husband. I flipped to the third section of the dossier. I announced that Donovan was not the only one enjoying the spoils of corporate theft. I detailed the exorbitant charges made to a highly restricted American Express card. It was a card directly tied to my parents' primary retirement fund. I looked at Catherine, whose face was beginning to twitch with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. I told my mother that Brittany's famously curated designer closet, the one she flaunted in every society magazine spread, was entirely fraudulent. I read off the receipts for the exclusive handbags, the custom luggage, and the countless pairs of imported shoes. I stated clearly that every single piece of haute couture draped across my sister's body had been purchased with her own parents' stolen retirement funds. I watched Brittany shrink into her chair. She looked around the room, desperate for an ally, but the aunts and uncles were staring at her with naked disgust. I told her that she was wearing the physical manifestation of our parents' financial ruin. Catherine suddenly shot up from her seat, her heavy chair nearly toppling backward. She slammed her hands onto the table, her emerald rings flashing. She screamed that I was lying. She shrieked that I was a bitter, vindictive liar who fabricated these documents just to ruin her perfect family. She demanded that Charles throw me out of the house immediately. She yelled that Donovan and Brittany would never betray them completely, refusing to accept the reality staring her right in the face. Charles did not listen to her. He did not say a single word. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical. He reached across the table, his hands shaking violently, and grabbed the thick stack of papers. He pulled the dossier toward him, bringing the crisp pages close to his face. The entire dining room watched in suffocating silence as the patriarch of the family reviewed the undeniable evidence. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted frantically across the spreadsheets, the bank statements, and the official transfer logs. He recognized the account numbers immediately. He recognized the official letterheads from his own private wealth managers. Then his gaze locked onto the final page. It was the authorization form for the massive home equity line of credit. I watched Charles's chest heave as he stared at the bottom of the page. He was staring directly at his own signature, perfectly forged by the exact man he had just praised as the absolute pinnacle of success. Their fragile illusion of untouchable wealth collapsed, leaving nothing but absolute ruin and a bitter, inescapable humiliation permanently filling the dead air tonight. Charles's hands began to shake with a violent tremor as the crushing reality of his forged signature settled into his rigid mind. The heavy ivory paper of his newly updated will, the very document he had used to publicly disinherit me just moments prior, suddenly looked like a completely worthless piece of trash. He crumpled the damning bank statements in his fists and slowly raised his head. The thick vein in his neck pulsed with a dangerous, erratic rhythm. He did not speak at first. He let out a low, guttural sound that resembled a wounded animal before launching his body across the polished mahogany table. He lunged directly at Donovan, knocking over a heavy silver candelabra. It crashed onto the fine china plates, sending sharp shards of porcelain and drops of hot wax flying across the pristine white tablecloth, but nobody in the room dared to move. Charles grabbed Donovan aggressively by the lapels of his expensive velvet dinner jacket, yanking him forward with such force that Donovan's ornate wooden chair tipped backward and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. Charles screamed with a deafening volume that physically shook the crystal chandelier hanging above us. He demanded to know exactly how his own son-in-law could maliciously steal his entire life's work. He violently spat the words, his red face mere inches from Donovan's sweating forehead, fiercely demanding the immediate return of his stolen equity. Donovan completely lost whatever tiny shred of false bravado he had left. He threw his hands up defensively, desperately cowering away from my father's furious, suffocating grip. Heavy sweat poured down his face, completely ruining his carefully curated appearance. He stammered frantically, his voice cracking and pitching upward as he pathetically tried to blame the global financial markets for his own crimes. He babbled wildly about cryptocurrency fluctuations and unavoidable margin calls, desperately claiming that he was only trying to double the family wealth through aggressive investments. He swore repeatedly that the market had taken an unpredictable temporary downturn and that he just needed a little more time and capital to make everything back. The surrounding aunts and uncles watched this pathetic, cowardly display in absolute horrified silence. Uncle Arthur covered his mouth in total shock, while Aunt Miriam gripped her chest tightly, her panicked eyes darting toward the hallway exit as if she actively wanted to flee the impending financial blast radius. Seeing her husband rapidly crumbling under the undeniable weight of his massive financial crimes, Brittany immediately went into pure selfish survival mode. She did not defend him. She did not attempt to offer a united front. Instead, she threw him directly under the bus, without a single second of hesitation. She burst into loud, highly theatrical tears, burying her face deeply in her hands and sobbing with incredibly exaggerated force. She wailed to the room that she had absolutely no idea what Donovan had been doing behind closed doors. She pointed a violently trembling finger at her husband, shrieking that he had maliciously tricked her, completely manipulated her, and continually lied about exactly where the money for her extensive designer wardrobe had actually come from. She cried out loudly to Catherine, frantically begging for protection, claiming she was just an innocent, trusting victim of a manipulative con artist. It was a spectacular performance of pure self-preservation, but the structural damage was already done. The entire dining room fully knew she had gleefully paraded around in stolen wealth for years. Catherine, suddenly realizing that her golden child was heavily implicated and her husband was entirely bankrupt, desperately tried to salvage the burning wreckage of her perfect manufactured life. She looked at Charles, who was still aggressively clutching Donovan's ruined jacket, and then her wide eyes darted toward the glossy Forbes magazine, resting untouched on the table. Her gaze eventually locked onto my face. I watched her highly calculated, manipulative brain switch gears with terrifying, seamless speed. The absolute venom and raw disgust she had hurled at me just 10 minutes earlier completely vanished, instantly replaced by a sickening, manufactured warmth that made my skin crawl. She smoothed down the front of her expensive emerald gown, forced a shaky, desperate smile onto her face, and walked slowly toward my isolated end of the long dining table. She reached her hands out pleadingly toward me, her voice dripping with thick, artificial sweetness. She told me that this entire situation was simply a terrible, unfortunate misunderstanding, a massive mistake that we could easily overcome if we just stood strongly united. She completely ignored the glaring fact that she had just publicly labeled me a selfish sociopath. She entirely ignored the $30,000 Aspen invoice she had just tried to weaponize against me to ensure my humiliation. Instead, she looked at me with wide, pleading, desperate eyes and told me that family must always stick together during hard times. She clasped her hands together tightly and actively begged me to use my newly revealed $85 million valuation to bail them out of this disaster. She insisted that my incredible financial success was a blessing, a miraculous gift meant to save the family empire from total ruin. She stepped even closer, her voice growing significantly more frantic as she blatantly tried to guilt-trip me into absolute submission. She repeatedly reminded me of all the early years they had supposedly sheltered and provided for me, completely erasing the decades of severe emotional abuse and targeted neglect. She told me that I owed it to the prestigious family name to immediately clear Donovan's massive debts and permanently restore Charles's lost equity. She painted a highly pathetic picture of our shared legacy, falsely claiming that my personal wealth was essentially their wealth, and that a good, loyal daughter would never let her own parents suffer the crushing humiliation of a public bankruptcy. She reached out to tightly grip my arm, fake tears rapidly pooling in her eyes as she begged me to write the check to save their ancestral home and to be the ultimate savior they so desperately needed right now. I did not pull away from her grasping touch. I did not shrink back into the drafty corner. I simply looked down at her manicured hand, resting heavily on my tailored sleeve, and let out a sharp, incredibly cold laugh. The sound cut right through her desperate, pathetic pleading, completely shattering her fragile illusion of control over me. I looked Catherine dead in the eye and calmly reminded her of her own exact hateful words. I clearly stated that just 10 short minutes ago, I was the ultimate family disgrace. I reminded her that she had aggressively demanded I leave the table, loudly declaring that I was totally unworthy of the family name and entirely permanently cut out of the inheritance. I told her that she could not possibly expect the disgraced sociopathic daughter to suddenly open her checkbook and fully fund their failing criminal charade. Her face went entirely slack as she realized her attempted gaslighting was completely ineffective. I reached down into the dark, comforting space of my leather briefcase one last time. I pulled out a third heavily bound folder, completely ignoring Catherine's horrified, unblinking stare. I dropped it onto the table with a resounding thud, announcing that the financial ruin was only the beginning. I opened the heavy black cover of the third folder. I did not pull out bank statements or crypto ledgers this time. I reached inside and withdrew a thick stack of official legal documents bound by a heavy brass clip. I placed my hand flat against the top page and pushed it firmly across the long stretch of the mahogany table. The thick packet slid perfectly over the polished wood, coming to a gentle stop right against my father's crystal water goblet. Charles stared down at the documents as if they were venomous snakes. He did not want to touch them, but his eyes were uncontrollably drawn to the bold, capitalized legal header printed across the top page. I watched his breath hitch in his chest. I told him to pick it up. I told him to look very closely at the signatures, the filing dates, and the official state seals stamped onto the heavy parchment. Charles reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the packet. I announced to the deadly silent dining room that the documents he was holding were the master deed and the original mortgage note to the Beacon Hill estate. I watched the confusion war with the rising panic on my father's face. I explained the mechanics of the trap they had so willingly walked into. I told him that when Donovan drained the offshore accounts to cover his catastrophic crypto margins, he caused a massive immediate liquidity crisis for the entire family portfolio. I kept my voice incredibly calm, explaining the financial reality with the clinical precision of a corporate auditor. I stated that Charles had missed his first mortgage payment exactly 4 months ago. I reminded him that his private wealth managers had sent multiple urgent notices regarding the impending default notices that Donovan had systematically intercepted and destroyed to hide his embezzlement. I watched Charles slowly turn his furious gaze toward Donovan, who was currently shrinking into his velvet chair, sweating profusely and completely unable to make eye contact. I told my father that his absolute blind trust in his golden son-in-law had resulted in a total unmitigated default on the family estate. Catherine let out a sharp, panicked gasp. She gripped the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. She practically demanded to know what a default meant for her home, her social standing, and her immediate future. I turned my attention directly to my mother, letting a cold, victorious smile spread across my face. I told her that a default meant the bank possessed the absolute legal right to auction the property off to the highest bidder to recoup their massive losses. Brittany let out another theatrical sob, whining that they were all going to be homeless and begging someone to fix it. I looked back at Charles, who was still staring at the deed with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. I told him that he did not need to worry about a public bank auction. I announced that the bank had already quietly sold the bad debt to a private corporate entity to avoid a messy, drawn-out foreclosure process. I let the silence stretch, watching the gears turn in my father's head as he tried to piece together the identity of this mysterious corporate buyer. I did not make him wait long. I stated clearly and loudly that my data analytics firm, the exact same company I had built from the ground up while they mocked my choices, was the parent company of that purchasing entity. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the mahogany table, and looked directly into my father's defeated eyes. I told him that I had bought the debt in full. I announced to the entire room that I was now the sole undisputed legal owner of the Beacon Hill estate. I watched the absolute devastation wash over Charles's face as the ultimate irony finally struck him. I pointed out the brutal, undeniable reality of his situation. I told him that the magnificent, sprawling ancestral home he had just proudly promised to give to Brittany and Donovan actually belonged entirely to the daughter he had just publicly disinherited. The sheer magnitude of the power shift hit the room like a physical shockwave. Charles erupted. The shock completely evaporated instantly, replaced by a blinding, desperate rage. He slammed the deed down onto the table and pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my face. He screamed that this was an illegal, underhanded corporate theft. He roared that he would immediately hire the most ruthless, expensive litigation attorneys in the entire country. He threatened to sue me for fraud, for deceptive business practices, and for malicious interference. He shouted that he would drag me through the courts for decades until I was entirely bankrupt and begging for his mercy. He promised to entirely destroy my reputation and tear my company apart piece by piece. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I stood completely still, letting his desperate, empty threats echo off the dining room walls until he finally ran out of breath. I waited for the total, suffocating silence to return to the room. I looked at his red, furious face and let out a soft, amused sigh. I pointed out one final, devastating legal reality that he had completely overlooked in his blind rage. I reminded Charles that in order to hire the most ruthless, expensive litigation attorneys in the country, a person actually needed to have money. I stated that his accounts were entirely drained, his equity was completely gone, and his primary asset was now legally registered in my name. I told my father that he could not even afford to hire a traffic lawyer, let alone launch a massive corporate lawsuit against an $85 million analytics firm. I watched the last remaining shred of his absolute authority permanently shatter. I smiled at him. The checkmate was absolute. I won. Charles's mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a suffocating fish pulled violently from the water. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles practically tearing through his pale, aging skin. He weakly sputtered that he still had connections, that he could easily find a hungry, aggressive attorney willing to take the case on a contingency basis, desperate for a piece of my newly announced fortune. He insisted that his powerful country club friends would happily float him a personal loan to crush a disobedient daughter. I let him spin his pathetic, desperate fantasies for a few seconds before completely dismantling his final illusion of safety. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished table, invading his physical space, and forcing him to look directly into my eyes. I told him that I genuinely welcomed a lawsuit. I practically dared him to file the initial paperwork tomorrow morning. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum destructive impact. I explained that launching a massive civil litigation suit against my corporate entity would automatically trigger a mandatory, deeply exhaustive phase of legal discovery. I broke down the exact mechanics of what that meant for the people sitting in this dining room. I told Charles that a federal judge would immediately mandate a comprehensive forensic audit of every single family asset, every offshore holding, and every line of credit attached to the Wilson name. I turned my gaze slowly toward Donovan, who was currently slumped in his chair, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. I announced that a team of ruthless federal auditors would systematically trace every single penny that Donovan had secretly funneled out of my parents' retirement accounts. They would legally compel the banks to produce the forged signature logs. They would instantly uncover the massive, unauthorized wire transfers sent directly to unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges. I raised my voice slightly, letting the cold reality echo off the high vaulted ceilings. I stated that this was no longer a simple family dispute or a civil disagreement over real estate. I told my father that his beloved golden son-in-law had committed textbook undeniable wire fraud. Furthermore, because Charles and Catherine were both over the age of 65, the federal government would automatically classify Donovan's actions as aggravated elder financial abuse. A harsh, strangled sob escaped Catherine's throat. She pressed her napkin hard against her mouth, her eyes darting frantically between my father and the sweating, trembling man she had welcomed into her family. I did not soften my tone. I looked at Brittany, who was currently clutching her diamond necklace as if it were a physical shield. I informed my sister that the federal prosecutors would not stop with Donovan. I explained that because she had willingly and knowingly spent the stolen funds on her lavish, curated lifestyle, she would be heavily investigated as a direct accessory to the embezzlement. I painted a brutally clear picture of their immediate future. I told Charles that the absolute second he filed a lawsuit against me, he would be signing a one-way ticket to federal prison for the man sitting at his table, and he would be publicly dragging his favorite daughter into a massive criminal conspiracy. I asked him if his wounded pride was truly worth sending his golden child to a federal penitentiary. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of total surrender. Charles slowly released his grip on the table. His shoulders slumped forward, and the last remnants of his lifelong manufactured authority completely evaporated. He looked down at his useless updated will, the document he had proudly used to strip me of my inheritance just a half hour ago. He was a broken, bankrupt man, sitting in a house he no longer owned, staring at a son-in-law who had systematically destroyed his entire life. I reached into the leather briefcase one final time. I bypassed the spreadsheets and the bank statements. I retrieved a single stark white document completely distinct from the heavy ivory parchment of my father's useless will. It was printed on standard legal paper, crisp and uncompromising. I held it up briefly, letting the bright light from the crystal chandelier illuminate the bold black text printed across the top. I did not pass it to my father. I simply dropped it directly onto the center of the table, watching it flutter down and land perfectly on top of Charles's worthless estate planning documents. I announced to the paralyzed room that the paper resting on the table was a formal, legally binding notice of eviction. I did not give them a 30-day courtesy period. I did not offer a graceful, gradual transition. I looked at Catherine, whose face was completely streaked with ruined mascara, and told her that my corporate security team would be arriving at this property tomorrow evening. I gave them exactly 24 hours to pack whatever personal items they could fit into their vehicles and vacate my property. I stated clearly that anything left inside the house after the deadline would be considered abandoned property and immediately thrown into a dumpster. I told them that the locks would be completely changed, the security codes would be reset, and any attempt to enter the grounds after tomorrow night would be treated as criminal trespassing. Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She launched herself out of her chair, begging our parents to do something, pleading with Donovan to fix the nightmare he had created. Catherine buried her face in her arms and began weeping loudly, a deep, mournful wail that echoed tragically through the grand dining room. Donovan remained frozen, staring blankly at the formal eviction notice, fully comprehending that his entire facade of wealth and success was permanently obliterated. Charles sat entirely motionless, a hollow shell of the domineering patriarch he had been for decades. I did not stay to watch them mourn the death of their toxic empire. I had delivered the absolute truth, and my work in this house was completely finished. I calmly snapped my leather briefcase shut. The sharp metallic click cut right through the sounds of my family's chaotic theatrical weeping. I turned my back on the screaming, crying relatives. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not look over my shoulder. I walked with steady, purposeful steps across the antique Persian rug, moving away from the shattered remnants of the formal Christmas dinner. I stepped out into the grand foyer, pulled open the heavy oak front door, and walked out into the crisp, freezing winter air, leaving their entire world in absolute ruins behind me. The biting, violent wind of Christmas Eve gave way to a blindingly bright and painfully clear Christmas morning. I sat comfortably behind the leather-wrapped steering wheel of my car, parked safely at the far end of my childhood street. The engine hummed a quiet, steady rhythm, keeping the cabin perfectly warm against the freezing Boston winter just beyond the glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my steaming black coffee. The bitter, dark roast tasted like absolute, unmitigated victory. The exclusive neighborhood was practically dead. The wealthy residents of Beacon Hill were securely tucked inside their multi-million-dollar homes, opening lavish gifts and sipping imported champagne by their roaring fireplaces. They had absolutely no idea that a massive, catastrophic implosion was actively unfolding just a few doors down. I checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. It was exactly 8 in the morning. I did not have to wait long for the main event to begin. The pristine silence of the affluent street was suddenly shattered by the harsh grinding gears of a heavily dented bright yellow moving truck. The massive commercial vehicle barreled down the narrow cobblestone road, completely ignoring the polite neighborhood speed limits. It jumped the curb slightly and pulled up aggressively right onto the immaculate front lawn of the estate. The heavy, muddy tires tore deep, ugly gashes directly into Catherine's prized imported winter landscaping, crushing the manicured hedges under its massive weight. The heavy oak front door of the mansion violently swung open. The scene that spilled out onto the grand stone portico was nothing short of a masterpiece of total degradation. Charles and Catherine, the polished, untouchable king and queen of Boston high society, stumbled out into the freezing air. They were not wearing their custom-tailored cashmere coats or their Italian leather boots. They looked entirely disheveled, their faces pale gaunt and deeply hollowed from a complete lack of sleep. To my absolute delight, they were not carrying monogrammed designer luggage or coordinated travel trunks. They were physically dragging heavy, generic black plastic trash bags across the stone porch. The cheap plastic stretched and tore against the sharp edges of the concrete steps, spilling random articles of expensive clothing and velvet hangers directly onto the frosty grass. Catherine's face was completely contorted in a mask of pure, unfiltered panic. She kept looking frantically over her shoulder, terrified that one of her wealthy neighbors might look out their window and witness her ultimate, undeniable humiliation. Charles struggled with a massively overstuffed bag, his chest heaving with extreme exertion. He looked incredibly frail, his usual commanding, arrogant posture totally broken under the crushing weight of his absolute financial ruin. The grand illusion of their powerful, united family had completely evaporated overnight. I watched with deep, settling satisfaction as I realized that not a single aunt, uncle, or cousin had stayed to help them pack. The moment I walked out that door last night, the extended family had clearly scrambled for the exits, desperately fleeing the toxic blast radius of Donovan's massive financial crimes. They had abandoned Charles and Catherine without a second thought, completely unwilling to tie their own pristine reputations to a sinking criminal ship. The great Wilson family loyalty was nothing but a cheap transactional illusion, and the second the money vanished, so did the family. A loud, desperate shout echoed down the driveway. Donovan practically burst through the front door, nearly tripping over a torn trash bag. He was still wearing the exact same velvet dinner jacket from the night before, though it was now violently wrinkled, stained, and completely ruined. He was gripping his cell phone so tightly, his knuckles were stark white, screaming frantically into the receiver. I rolled my window down just a fraction of an inch, letting the freezing air carry his panicked, cracking voice directly to my ears. He was begging his offshore brokers to release his frozen funds, swearing violently when the automated messages repeatedly informed him that his accounts were entirely locked and heavily flagged. His frantic pacing resembled a trapped animal. He kept running his hands through his messy hair, wildly demanding answers from fixers and bankers who had already completely abandoned him. His shell companies were dead. The stolen equity was gone. He was finally waking up to the terrifying reality that his entire identity as a financial genius was permanently destroyed. Brittany followed closely behind him, but she did not look like the smug, victorious golden child who had sneered at me across the dining table. She looked like a completely broken, hysterical child. She stumbled barefoot down the icy driveway, completely ignoring the freezing temperature against her skin. Her designer gown from the night before was torn at the hem and dragging through the mud. She collapsed directly onto the cold, hard concrete curb, burying her face in her knees. She was aggressively clutching 3 incredibly expensive rare Birkin bags to her chest, treating the fraud-funded leather purses like they were her actual life preservers. She sobbed with a loud, theatrical intensity, wailing to the empty street about her ruined life, her lost status, and her impending homelessness. She screamed at Donovan, throwing a barrage of vicious, hateful insults at the man she had just fiercely defended, demanding that he magically fix the mess he had created. Donovan completely ignored her, entirely consumed by his own impending legal destruction. They were turning on each other with brutal speed, perfectly demonstrating the absolute lack of genuine love in their manufactured marriage. I was just about to roll my window up and drive away to enjoy my very first peaceful Christmas when a flash of bright color caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A vehicle was turning onto the quiet street, moving with a slow, deliberate, and undeniable authority. The unmistakable red and blue flashing lights of a local police cruiser cut sharply through the crisp morning sunlight. The heavy cruiser rolled smoothly past my parked car, advancing steadily toward the estate. It did not use its siren, but the silent, rhythmic flashing of the lights was more than enough to completely paralyze the frantic activity on the lawn. Charles froze, dropping his plastic bag entirely. Catherine let out a sharp shriek, instantly clutching her husband's arm in pure terror. Donovan dropped his cell phone directly onto the icy driveway, his face draining of all remaining color as his worst nightmare materialized in front of him. Brittany stopped sobbing, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the approaching vehicle. The police cruiser pulled up, perfectly angling itself to completely block the bright yellow moving truck from leaving the driveway. The heavy car door swung open, and the county sheriff stepped out into the freezing air. His face was entirely stern, offering absolutely no holiday greetings. He reached into the front seat of his cruiser and pulled out a heavy metal clipboard, his eyes locking directly onto Donovan. The heavy boots of the county sheriff crunched loudly against the frosty gravel of the driveway. He did not look like a man arriving to exchange pleasant holiday greetings. He walked with the rigid, uncompromising posture of an officer executing a strict court mandate. 2 armed deputies flanked him, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts as they surveyed the manicured lawn currently littered with ripped plastic garbage bags and discarded designer clothing. Charles immediately abandoned the heavy bag he was dragging and puffed out his chest, desperately attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. He marched aggressively toward the sheriff, his face flushed with a dark, terrifying shade of violet. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the officer's badge and began to shout. Charles demanded to speak to the chief of police. He screamed that he was a major political donor in this county, that he single-handedly funded the police department's annual gala, and that he would have the sheriff's badge stripped from his uniform by noon. The sheriff did not flinch. He did not step back. He stood completely still and let Charles exhaust his lungs in the freezing morning air. When Charles finally paused to draw a ragged breath, the sheriff calmly raised the heavy metal clipboard. He stated in a loud, clear voice that rang across the entire estate that he was acting on an expedited, fully authenticated court order. He tapped the thick stack of papers attached to the clipboard, explaining that the property had legally changed hands, the default was absolute, and the new corporate owner had filed an emergency injunction to secure the premises against potential damage or theft. Charles tried to snatch the clipboard, but the sheriff pulled it back with a sharp, warning glare. The officer explicitly informed my father that his political connections were entirely irrelevant because his bank accounts were frozen and his influence had completely evaporated. The sheriff announced that he and his deputies were dispatched solely to oversee the immediate eviction and to guarantee that not a single fixture, piece of artwork, or structural element was damaged or removed from the property. Donovan, frantic and sweating despite the cold, came sprinting out the front doors carrying a heavy gilded oil painting under his arm. A deputy immediately stepped into his path, blocking the exit. The sheriff barked a harsh command instructing Donovan to put the painting down immediately. He read directly from the injunction stating that only personal clothing and basic toiletries were permitted to leave the grounds. Every piece of art, every stick of antique furniture, and every piece of jewelry purchased with family funds now belonged to the holding company to offset the massive debts Donovan had fraudulently accumulated. Brittany let out a piercing wail from the curb, dropping her Birkin bags and collapsing onto the freezing concrete. She screamed that it was a violation of her rights, but the sheriff simply pointed a stern finger toward the street, ordering them to finish packing their trash bags and vacate the property line within the hour or face immediate arrest for trespassing. The absolute reality of their destruction finally crushed Charles. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling slightly, and slumped against the cold stone pillar of his former mansion. The neighbors were beginning to emerge from their homes, drawn by the shouting and the police lights. Wealthy doctors, judges, and corporate executives stood on their pristine lawns in their plush winter coats, watching the mighty Wilson family being systematically stripped of their dignity and their home on Christmas morning. Charles hid his face in his hands, entirely broken by the public spectacle of his ultimate ruin. Catherine was frantically trying to stuff a pile of loose, tangled velvet dresses into a torn plastic bag when she suddenly stopped. Her eyes darted wildly across the chaotic scene, looking for any possible escape route. She looked past the police cruisers, past the idling moving truck, and stared directly down the long, winding driveway. Her gaze locked onto my car parked silently at the curb. I sat perfectly still behind the steering wheel, my hands resting warmly against my coffee cup, watching her through the tinted glass. A wild, desperate energy seized my mother. She dropped the plastic bag, letting the expensive dresses spill directly into a puddle of freezing mud. She shoved past Donovan, sprinted clumsily past the sheriff, and ran frantically down the long stretch of asphalt. Her breath plumed in the freezing air, her hair completely unraveled from its signature perfect updo. She reached my car and threw herself against the passenger door, slamming her bare, freezing palms violently against the glass. She pressed her face against the window, her features twisted in an expression of absolute primal panic. She begged me to open the door. She pleaded for mercy, her voice muffled but distinct through the heavy glass. She screamed that she was my mother, that she had given birth to me, that I could not leave her to freeze on the streets on Christmas Day. I watched her tears freeze against her cheeks. I did not unlock the doors. I did not turn off the engine. Catherine sank to her knees, her hands sliding down the glass, leaving smeared handprints behind. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with total desperation. She offered the ultimate surrender. She sobbed that they did not need the master suite. She cried that they did not need the grand dining room or the parlors. She begged me to just let them live in the unfinished basement. She promised they would be quiet, that they would stay completely out of my way, that they would essentially become ghosts in their own home if I would just let them stay out of the cold. I placed my coffee cup carefully into the center console. I reached over and pressed the electronic button on the door panel. The passenger window hummed quietly as it lowered exactly 2 inches. The freezing winter air rushed into the warm cabin of my car, carrying the sound of my mother's ragged, desperate weeping directly to my ears. Catherine gasped, grabbing the edge of the slightly open window, believing she had finally broken through my defenses. I leaned across the passenger seat and looked directly into her terrified, ruined eyes. I kept my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any emotion or warmth. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, and I delivered the final fatal blow. The bedrooms are for the real family. I pressed the button. The window glided smoothly upward, forcing Catherine to snatch her fingers away before the glass sealed shut. I shifted the car into drive, pressed my foot firmly onto the accelerator, and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving her kneeling in the freezing street. 3 months passed with the brutal, uncompromising speed of a corporate takeover. The absolute destruction of the Wilson family empire did not happen in secret. It was a spectacular public immolation that splashed across the front pages of every financial publication in Boston. The federal authorities moved with terrifying efficiency, acting on the detailed, irrefutable forensic audit my analytics firm had quietly provided to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Donovan was the very first to fall. His former brokerage firm, panicked by the sudden freeze on the Wilson accounts, launched their own internal investigation to save themselves. They immediately discovered the staggering depth of his embezzlement. The golden son-in-law had not just stolen from Charles. He had systematically defrauded 3 other wealthy elderly clients to cover his catastrophic cryptocurrency losses. The FBI raided his newly rented, incredibly cheap motel room just before dawn on a Tuesday. He was indicted on 42 counts of wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and elder financial abuse. The federal prosecutor publicly announced that they were seeking a minimum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Donovan could not afford a private attorney. He was currently sitting in a federal holding facility entirely reliant on an overworked public defender who had already advised him to take a plea deal. Brittany's manufactured, curated reality shattered completely. Without my father's stolen money funding her lifestyle, she plummeted into total destitution. She frantically attempted to sell her prized Birkin bags and diamond jewelry on the black market, only to have federal agents intercept the sales and seize the items as stolen assets. Left with absolutely nothing, Brittany was forced to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The spoiled, arrogant princess who had once demanded a private jet for her birthday was now facing the brutal, unforgiving reality of minimum wage labor. She secured a job folding sweaters and restocking shelves at a discount retail store in a rundown strip mall on the outskirts of the city. She wore a hideous, oversized polyester uniform vest, standing on her feet for 9 hours a day. Last week, a former rival from her exclusive country club recognized her struggling to scan a discounted pair of shoes at the cash register. The woman took a picture and posted it to social media. The humiliation was absolute, total, and completely inescapable. Brittany spent her 15-minute breaks crying in the employee restroom, realizing that no amount of screaming or throwing tantrums could fix her completely ruined life. She had tied her entire existence to a convicted felon, and now she was paying the ultimate inescapable price. Charles and Catherine fared no better. The mighty patriarch and his flawless society queen were currently living in a cramped, drafty 2-bedroom rental apartment situated above a noisy, grease-stained diner. The heavy scent of stale cooking oil and cheap onions permeated their tiny, uncarpeted living room. They were entirely cut off from the wealthy social circles they used to dominate with an iron fist. Their country club membership was immediately revoked due to unpaid dues and the sheer toxic scandal of their criminal association. Their former friends and affluent neighbors treated them like they carried a highly contagious disease. When Catherine attempted to attend a local charity luncheon, she was stopped at the door by security and politely but firmly asked to leave the premises. They were drowning in a suffocating ocean of legal fees. Charles had desperately hired a sleazy, low-tier defense attorney to fight off the impending accessory charges related to Donovan's fraud. Every single penny they managed to scrape together went directly to their lawyer, leaving them struggling to afford basic groceries and utility bills. Charles spent his days sitting in a cheap folding lawn chair by a tiny window, staring blankly at a brick wall. The domineering, terrifying man who had commanded boardrooms and dictated my entire childhood was gone, replaced by a frail, defeated old man who jumped every time the doorbell rang. Terrified, it was another federal subpoena. Catherine spent her days bitterly arguing with Brittany over the phone, blaming her daughter for marrying Donovan, completely ignoring her own role in forcing that disastrous union. Their family bond, built entirely on money and status, had dissolved into pure, venomous resentment. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I had spent 30 years suffocating under their rigid, conditional love, watching them celebrate mediocrity while aggressively punishing my independence. They had designed their own destruction, and I had simply handed them the tools to finish the job. My life was moving forward with incredible, unstoppable momentum. Horizon Analytics had just secured 3 massive federal contracts, doubling our valuation and cementing my position as a major player in the tech industry. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer feared their judgment. I had successfully excised the rot from my life and the future was entirely my own. I stood precisely in the center of the grand foyer of the Beacon Hill estate. The massive house was completely empty, stripped of Catherine's oppressive antique furniture and Charles's heavy, suffocating oil paintings. The silence in the mansion was no longer heavy or toxic. It felt expansive, clean, and full of limitless potential. The morning sunlight poured through the large arched windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I held a steaming cup of coffee in my left hand and a rolled-up blueprint in my right. Standing alongside me was a highly skilled team of 5 elite structural contractors, all wearing heavy leather work boots and bright yellow hard hats. I unrolled the blueprint carefully and spread it completely flat across a makeshift wooden work table. I looked at the lead contractor and pointed directly at the main load-bearing wall separating the old formal dining room from the kitchen. I smiled, feeling the ghosts of the past finally fading away into nothingness. We were going to tear the entire thing straight to the ground. The sheriff slowly lowered his clipboard. His expression was a carefully carved mask of absolute authority forged through years of dealing with entitled, desperate people who suddenly found themselves stripped of their power. He fixed his gaze directly on my father, who was still slumped against the cold stone pillar of his former mansion. The sheriff's voice boomed across the frosty, ruined lawn, carrying a sharp, uncompromising clarity that demanded total submission. He informed Charles that he was officially enforcing a legal expedited eviction order, fully backed by the federal court system. He stated that the property had legally transitioned to a corporate holding company, and that any attempt to interfere with the immediate removal of their personal non-asset belongings would result in their immediate arrest. Charles's face flushed a deep, humiliated purple. He lunged forward, his hands balling into trembling fists, his voice cracking with desperate, manufactured outrage. He screamed that he was Charles Wilson, that he had built this neighborhood, that he knew the mayor, the judges, and every powerful attorney in the state. He roared that this eviction was an illegal farce, a coordinated corporate attack, and that he would personally ensure the sheriff lost his badge for participating in this circus. The sheriff did not flinch. He did not step back. He calmly rested his hand on his utility belt, a subtle but undeniable assertion of his absolute authority. He looked Charles directly in the eyes and completely dismantled his final, desperate illusion of power. The sheriff informed him that the mayor was well aware of the situation and had explicitly declined to intervene in a federal matter involving aggravated wire fraud. He stated that the powerful attorneys Charles was threatening to call were the same attorneys who had quietly, aggressively distanced themselves the moment the SEC investigations into Donovan's shell companies became public knowledge. The sheriff tapped the heavy metal clipboard against his thigh, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. He told Charles that his connections were gone, his money was frozen, and his leverage had entirely evaporated. The legal paperwork, the sheriff explained with brutal, crushing finality, was absolutely airtight. He gave my father one final, uncompromising command. He ordered him to finish packing his trash bags and vacate the property line within the hour, or he would be physically removed and charged with criminal trespassing. The reality of his total, unmitigated destruction finally broke the patriarch. Charles crumpled his shoulders, slumping heavily, and he slowly sank back against the cold stone, a defeated, bankrupt man entirely stripped of his empire. Catherine, meanwhile, was frantically tearing through a pile of expensive velvet dresses that had spilled from a torn plastic bag, her hands shaking violently. Her eyes darted wildly across the chaotic scene, desperately searching for any remaining lifeline. She looked past the flashing lights of the police cruiser, past the massive, idling moving truck, and her gaze locked onto my car, parked silently at the curb. I sat perfectly still behind the steering wheel, watching her through the tinted glass. A wild, primal desperation suddenly seized my mother. She dropped the expensive dresses into the freezing mud and sprinted clumsily down the long asphalt driveway. Her breath plumed in the cold air, her hair completely unraveled, her face a mask of pure terror. She reached my car and threw herself against the passenger door, slamming her bare, freezing palms violently against the glass. She pressed her face against the window, her features twisted in an expression of absolute panic. She begged me to open the door. She pleaded for mercy, her voice muffled but distinct through the heavy glass. She screamed that she was my mother, that I could not leave her to freeze on the streets on Christmas Day. I watched her tears freeze against her cheeks. I did not unlock the doors. I did not turn off the engine. Catherine sank to her knees, her hands sliding down the glass, leaving smeared handprints behind. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with total desperation. She offered the ultimate surrender. She sobbed that they did not need the master suite. She cried that they did not need the grand dining room or the parlors. She begged me to just let them live in the unfinished basement. She promised they would be quiet, that they would stay completely out of my way, that they would essentially become ghosts in their own home if I would just let them stay out of the cold. I placed my coffee cup carefully into the center console. I reached over and pressed the electronic button on the door panel. The passenger window hummed quietly as it lowered exactly 2 inches. The freezing winter air rushed into the warm cabin of my car, carrying the sound of my mother's ragged, desperate weeping directly to my ears. Catherine gasped, grabbing the edge of the slightly open window, believing she had finally broken through my defenses. I leaned across the passenger seat and looked directly into her terrified, ruined eyes. I kept my voice perfectly flat, entirely devoid of any emotion or warmth. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, and I delivered the final fatal blow. The bedrooms are for the real family. I pressed the button. The window glided smoothly upward, forcing Catherine to snatch her fingers away before the glass sealed shut. I shifted the car into drive, pressed my foot firmly onto the accelerator, and pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving her kneeling in the freezing street.